So it's great to welcome you here for this next session of our Rising Global Peace Forum, where we're discussing the culture of peace. And of course, we know that peace is far more than the relative absence of violent conflict. And we know that peace is so important for creating and sustaining an appropriate atmosphere for the enabling of individuals, communities, and the environment to flourish. And we need interconnectedness and we need interdependence of many elements to do this. This is relevant to us in Coventry, not just because we are a living legacy of peace and reconciliation, I think, but also this year as the designated UK City of Culture, it's really important for us. But perhaps nowhere in the world shows us that peace is more than the relative absence of violent conflict than Rwanda. So it's in this vein that I would like to introduce our next speaker to you, Dr. Ezechiel Sentama. Ezechiel is a Rwandan and a genocide survivor. He is currently a Marie Curie Research Fellow in the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations here in Coventry University. But before this, he worked for 10 years as senior lecturer in the Center for Conflict Management in the University of Rwanda. After this, he worked at the University of Gothenburg and at Linnaeus University in Sweden. His expertise and passion is peace and reconciliation, and he has carried out extensive research about these in Rwanda. His most recent work includes examining counter-narratives in identity conflicts, very important for us in this theme this year, the opportunities and challenges for reconciliation in post-genocide Rwanda, and he's been carrying out an examination of the role of cooperatives in reconciliation in Rwanda. So Ezechiel, I'm really pleased to welcome you to this global forum again, to Rising, and we look forward very much to hearing your talk on reconciliation in Rwanda. Is it real? Thank you.
I thank you so much for having me, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. I was pleased and very happy to come actually to Coventry. I was longing for coming to Coventry as a city of reconciliation and a city of peace. My presentation about reconciliation in Rwanda, whether it is real or not, we base on my personal experience as a Rwandan, as a survivor, as somebody who has extensively conducted research on peace and reconciliation in Rwanda, but also I base on other scholarly research on reconciliation in Rwanda. As a Marie Curie researcher at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, researching on transitional justice and reconciliation in Rwanda, but also in Algeria. I'm looking at how various mechanisms of transitional justice and reconciliation are implemented, and what happens to peace building when those mechanisms are combined.
Oh, yes.
So whether they are complementary or whether they're not.
So that's very interesting, thinking about other structures of peace building, of course, in Rwanda in particular, where you have traditional traditional systems of peace building and peacemaking, really. So it's interesting to see a comparison between Algeria and Rwanda then.
Exactly. My presentation is outlined as follows. I will discuss Rwanda, the context of the conflict in Rwanda. I will also share with you briefly my personal testimony. I will address or make a presentation on reconciliation mechanisms that have been adopted in Rwanda. I will refer to my own research and other scholarly research. Yes, as I was saying, that I will focus on this outline, and then I was at the point of, so the background of the conflict in Rwanda, I will refer to the pre-colonial period, the colonial period, the post-colonial period. Especially with regard to the post-colonial period, I will refer to post-independence, first two republics, the 1990 up to 1994 genocide, civil war, but also 1994 genocide, and post-Civil War and genocide reconciliation process. So with regard to the pre-colonial period, it is very important to refer to history record that indicates that Rwanda was composed of three identity groups, which were referred to as social categories instead of anthropological categories or differences. So we had Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa groups. We shall see that the conflict arose between the first two groups, the Tutsi and the Hutu. So before colonial administration, Rwanda was a well-organized society, but power and wealth were always in the hands of Tutsi. And in this regard, cows or cattle were symbolizing wealth. The Hutu and the Twa, the two categories, were working or serving as servants of Tutsi. There was a culture of domination and obedience in Rwanda in that time, and the system of communication was informal. You can see cattle keepers who were Tutsi. You can also see potters or hunters and gatherers who were Twa. The first category of cow breeding people, the Tutsi, were the leading and were the ones who had power and wealth in the country. During colonial period, especially the Belgian administration, things start becoming formal this time with the introduction of school. Research has been conducted by the Belgian administration, and this time the three groups were identified based on their physical attributes. So race was this time institutionalized, and identity cards were introduced. As far as this research is concerned, Tutsi who were kings, who were leaders at that time, and who were dominating, were considered by the Belgian administration as a superior race. They were noble, intelligent, born with leadership qualities, and the sense of command. This was the outcome of research, their research. With regard to the Hutu, they indicate that the Hutu people were inferior, unintelligent, and they were born to understand and follow. They had strong physical strength, and they were fit for only heavy manual work. This is the reason why they had to work as servants of colonial administration and the Tutsi ruling elites. So consequences were there. The consequence was that the Tutsi, which research revealed as the minority, 14%, had to dominate the Hutu, the majority, 85%. So the colonial administration, the Belgian administration, favored Tutsi, and almost only Tutsi children had to go to schools, and the Tutsi elite had to occupy administrative posts. Hutu, the majority, this is in reference to history record, the Hutu majority were exploited through forced labor, which was considered by many scholars as a form of enslavement. Another consequence was that there was this time an institutionalization of polarization between Tutsi and Hutu. This time, Hutu majority were frustrated. They expressed anger, resentment, and hatred towards Tutsi. Now comes the post-colonial period, up to 1960s, when the country accessed independence and onwards. There was a Hutu, the majority, Hutu Revolution 1959, which ended the Tutsi domination and leadership. And it was the period in which Rwanda accessed independence in 1962. This time, power was now in the hands of the Hutu majority up to 1994. In 1959, because of the so-called Hutu revolution and consequent violence, some Tutsi, especially from the elite cycle, the leadership, found their way into exile in neighboring countries, especially in Uganda, Congo, Burundi, and Tanzania. But other Tutsis remained in the country and were discriminated. In 1990, the Tutsi and their children, those who had fled the country in 1959, organized themselves under the Rwanda Patriotic Front and launched a civil war. They called it a liberation war. And this war was launched from Uganda. The purpose was to bring about democracy in Rwanda and, of course, to overthrow the Hutu government. This was a deadly civil war, should be mentioned. But in 1993, peace accords were signed between the rebel group under RPF, Rwanda Patriotic Front, and the then government of Rwanda. In 1994, the plane that was carrying the Hutu president was shot down, and the president, along with anyone who was on board, they died on the spot. The civil war resumed immediately, and it was deadly. At the same time, the genocide started. The Tutsi who had remained in the country were exterminated, of course, along with others, including the Hutu sympathizers, because they refused to take part in the killings, or simply because they decided to protect Tutsis. The genocide ended with the Tutsi rebels' victory, and they captured power in July 1994. But around 1 million people had been killed within the 3 months period. But millions of other people also had lost their lives during the deadly 4-year civil war. The country was left with traumatized people. The country was on its knees. The social, economic, the human capital, all those kind of infrastructures were destroyed. The post-1994 genocide new government, now this time in the hands of Rwanda Patriotic Front, was committed to unite and reconcile Rwandans. Perhaps that I share my testimony before I get to the mechanisms that were put in place. During, I would say this, after independence, because I was born in 1971, I was victim of the government, the then government, the civil war, and the genocide. Not only I was persecuted, but I should take this opportunity to also remember others but at least I'm still alive. But others lost their lives, and many got injured. Even though I lost my family, my parents and other siblings, and many others, I survived. It was like a miracle. Just to share one, I have so many testimonies, this can take long, but I remember the time I was caught and tortured. I just remember the first kick by a military. The second time I remember, another thing that I remember was after 2 months, because I was in a coma for 2 months in the hospital. I don't know who brought me to the hospital. I thank God for that person whom I don't know up to now, who brought me to the hospital. After 3 months, I was in a coma. 2 months, I was in a coma. Then I stayed 6 months in the hospital. That was before genocide. It was during the Civil War, when Tutsi were also persecuted. The genocide is another story. But I would say that surviving is a miracle. I won't dwell much on that, but I will just share with you what I learned from that. After the genocide, because I had lost almost everyone, I was left with only one thing. That was anger, coupled with resentment and hatred. Of course, I was traumatized. But that's another story, maybe because of my parents, the way I was educated to forgive. I reached the level of, I kept searching, why do people kill others? And I got to the level of understanding that for human beings to commit atrocities to the extent of dehumanizing and exterminating others, it is because they died first. They lost their humanity first, and actually they deserve forgiveness. I reached that level of understanding that is why I forgave everyone. And perhaps I share this in the other sessions. The post-genocide government, the post-Civil War and genocide government was committed to reconciliation, and reconciliation mechanisms were put in place. The first was the national policy on reconciliation. The second was about laws. We'll get to that. There was the creation of the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission was also important, but also legal mechanisms were initiated. Foreign ones, in the example of UN International Tribunal, Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, domestic legal mechanisms such as Gacaca, but also ordinary courts, socio-economic development, and the grassroots initiatives. That was my personal testimony. I got to that. I resolved to say it's up to me. At this level, since I already I shared with you a glimpse of my testimony, I will maybe point that if we imagine a jungle, or a forest, where we have carnivores and herbivores. Carnivores, like a lion can eat a zebra. So for the lion to stop eating a zebra, it requires a lion to change to a herbivore. Otherwise, it will keep eating zebras. So it's up to zebras to stand and do something for the lion to turn herbivore or to become like a zebra. Then they will be the same. They will understand each other. So The national policy on reconciliation in Rwanda, but perhaps I'm not dwell much on that because it's a long text, but it refers to practices that underscore the identity of a shared citizenship, a shared culture, equal rights, trust, tolerance, respect. Some of the principles of this policy, and perhaps that is where, if you look at this policy, which is binding all reconciliation activities in the country, those principles and objectives perhaps are the backbone of the critiques which are there from citizens themselves and researchers and scholars. The policy principle, the first principle refers to the promotion of Rwandan identity, putting national interest first instead of ethnicity. Second, combating genocide ideology. Third, to combat all forms of divisions and discrimination, and to commemorate the 1994 genocide against Tutsi. The objectives are reflecting the principles, fighting divisionism and discrimination, genocide, fighting against genocide ideology, sensitizing Rwandans' education, empower Rwandans for them to be able to analyze their own problems and finding solutions, promoting a culture of peace, which is based on trust, tolerance, and human rights respect, to mentor Rwandans on patriotic values, and to promote values which exist already in Rwandan culture and customs. The laws, we have a list of laws, the Constitution, the law establishing the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, law instituting the punishment for offenses of discrimination and sectarianism, the presidential decree for pardon, the abolition of death penalty, because after genocide, some people were subject to death penalty, then this was stopped afterwards. The law encouraging genocide perpetrators to admit their wrongdoings, that's where there's a critique, encouraging people to admit, then be forgiven, a conditional, transactional forgiveness. The law establishing Gacaca courts, and the law punishing the crime of genocide ideology. The National Unity and Reconciliation Commission was created in 1999 to coordinate and lead all efforts which are reflecting or which are aimed at promoting reconciliation and unity in Rwanda. Here, I should emphasize that reconciliation in Rwanda is tied, connected to unity. They always refer to unity and reconciliation. So the law which created the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission stipulate that this commission has to engage with civic education. Those peace education schools which bring together people of all walks of life to discuss issues about reconciliation in Rwanda, to advise, to sensitize Rwandans as far as issues related to unity and reconciliation process are concerned, to engage or to do research, organize debates, to develop measures which are connected to reconciliation, such as memory or remembering, to describe and denounce and even fight against any act which is sowing discrimination against Rwandans and foreigners, to follow up on how public and private institutions, local and international organizations, which are operating in the country, even leaders and peoples in general, how do they comply with the national reconciliation, monitor all processes and people regarding how they engage with the reconciliation process. But also collaborating with the international organizations and institutions to promote reconciliation. Next. The government also emphasized the importance of socioeconomic development for everyone, but also, and most importantly, with regard to genocide survivors or victims, as well as vulnerable groups. Because there's a saying in Rwanda that the stomach, which is empty, when the stomach is empty, ears don't hear. There has been a creation of the Fonds National d'Assistance au Rescapés du Génocide, a fund which is aimed at protecting or supporting genocide survivors, all this to help them recover and be able to access socioeconomic infrastructures. So with regard to the legal or justice mechanisms, we have the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which was aimed at prosecuting persons who are responsible for all serious violation of international humanitarian law committed in Rwanda, but also in the neighboring countries in that year. But here, I would say that there's already a critique that these international legal mechanisms failed to prosecute others. It only prosecuted genocide suspect, while the mandate goes beyond genocide crimes. The national justice mechanism, there's a mistake here, but ordinary courts, they were not functioning in the country. So many judges had been killed or they have died. So the ordinary courts were not functioning given the big number of genocide suspects who have been arrested by the Rwanda Patriotic Front, and they were incarcerated. They were in jail, in prisons. Around 200,000 were in jail. It was impossible for the few ordinary courts to judge these people. So the new ordinary courts were overloaded. The government sought for a new mechanism, something which sounds new or innovative. That was the Gacaca court. The Gacaca courts, which are local or grassroots driven, not driven, it's a top-down mechanism, but which involves communities. The Gacaca were established by the Constitution as a homegrown solution, inspired by local customs or culture, because Rwandans used to settle their dispute or conflict in families seated together. Given the big number of genocide suspects who were incarcerated, the government judged important to revitalize or to revive this form of dispute resolution. For your information, 1,000 or 11,000 Gacaca were created in the country. Yes. They involve, next slide, Gacaca process involve lay judges. So it's not about judges who have gone to school or lawyers, just ordinary citizens who are judged as people with integrity. And they were given this mandate to address more than 200,000 suspects of the genocide. The critique here too, as is the case for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, is that they only prosecuted genocide suspect, and Gacaca process, which was aimed at also restorative justice, that is reconciliation, ended up being only retributive or punitive. Now we get to other mechanisms which were not top-down driven. These were community-driven or grassroots reconciliation driven mechanisms. This refers to community-driven initiatives by the civil society, including religious denominations. We have associations, we have cooperatives, reconciliation clubs, radio talks, the prison fellowship visits. My researchers, previous researchers, were especially focusing on the role of associations and cooperatives. The point was about the impact of contact-based projects or processes. When we bring victims or survivors and perpetrators together towards to complete or to achieve something that is common for both, which is known as a superordinate goal, what happens to their relationships? This was important because I realized that people themselves, without the involvement of the government, without any external involvement, are able to sit down and address their dispute and eventually restore the relationships. However, an institutional framework, good policies, good culture, good customs are important. The overall critiques of reconciliation process in Rwanda in general the critiques refer to mainly to the fact that the process of reconciliation in Rwanda is much more focusing on one violent event, that is the 1994 genocide. So the scholars criticize this process by arguing that the context in which the genocide took place is eclipsed, is forgotten, is neglected. They refer to the civil war, the 4-year-long deadly civil war, which involved, of course, victims, so many victims, Hutus, Tutsis, Twas, and even foreigners. Violence or violent events that took part in the past, in the history, in the near past, which are not taken into consideration. Then the argument is that reconciliation cannot be biased or one-sided, cannot focus on one event, while the event took place within a long history of a conflict and a bigger context of violence, such as the Civil War. Another critique is that justice that was provided was less and even non-restorative. It was retributive, punishing guilty genocide perpetrators only. For them, it was a biased justice, and other war crimes, other massacres, and other crimes against humanity were forgotten. Another critique was that reconciliation in Rwanda was an imposed one, an imposed process, a top-down and a national, which is focusing on institutions, building institutions, and forgetting the community-based reconciliation, forgetting the interpersonal, intergroup, or individual level of healing. Another critique was about the fact that forgiveness is institutionalized. It's not transformative, it is transactional. You confess your sins, you are released from prison, or you are forgiven. Another critique is about the ethnicization policy, which outlaws ethnic labels. to replace them with a pan-Rwandan national identity. De-ethnization or denying the ethnic dimension of the conflict for the critique is not favoring reconciliation. By the way, many commentators and scholars consider this fact of outlawing or denying or negating ethnicity in Rwanda as a paradox. It is paradoxical for them because the genocide is known as a genocide perpetrated against Tutsi. Then the Tutsi ethnic label is mentioned. The people wonder why eclipsing those ethnic labels which are part of the conflict. What do we learn from the process of reconciliation in Rwanda? The first lesson, as far as my research is concerned, is that there has always been a vicious cycle of power struggle. It's conflict which are related to power struggle and violence, of course, in Rwanda. Political power struggle. Anyone on power impose his or her own narrative, which does not solve anything, which can engender conflict and violence. A key lesson also learned is that genuine reconciliation, effective reconciliation, requires the most important aspect of it, which is healing. Healing both the victims or survivors, but also perpetrators. Victims are traumatized because of the injuries or violence they suffered. But also perpetrators are victims or are haunted or are traumatized by their own evil actions. So to bring about reconciliation, it is important to address the root causes of the conflict or violence, the context, the cultural context, the structural context, which constitute a root cause or a trigger of the conflict, towards an empathetic understanding. If this cognitive way of understanding is not there, it will be very difficult to restore humanity of both the victims and perpetrators. This draws me back to what is well known. It's a parable, actually. It's I think it's a Chinese parable. The Sound of the Forest, where a young boy needed to be a good leader. He needed wisdom. Then he went to the master, requesting the master to train him to be a good leader or a good manager, a good conflict transformer. And the wise man took him in the forest, and he requested him to stay in the forest for a whole year and come back with all the sounds he might or would have heard. The son stayed there for a year, and when he came back with a list of all the sounds of animals, whatever was in the forest. And the master or the wise man was not happy. He sent him back to the forest. Of course, the young boy was not happy because he thought the whole year had done everything. But when he went back, he came back with something new. He said, "Master, I have been able this time to hear the unheard. Instead of hearing what was in the forest, animals, but also I heard the sound of the forest itself, I was able to hear the sound of flowers opening, the sound of grass drinking the morning dew. I was also able to hear the sun warming the earth. Then the master told him, yes, if you are able to hear the unheard, which refers to being able to hear the feelings of people, perpetrators, survivors, the feelings of these people which are undressed, the feelings they have not been able to express. You can be able to hear those feelings, then you can be a good leader. If you can be able to access people's hurt with this empathetic understanding, then you can address any conflict. I also learned that for reconciliation to be effective, genuine, a favorable space is important. Perhaps a number of mechanisms can be combined. Perhaps the top and the bottom-up approach can be brought together toward integration and hybridity. And most importantly, a culture of peace, which addresses the us and them dichotomy, the insider and outsider, the enemy image is important towards the feeling of that we are human beings. Instead of hating human actors, we need to hate bad actions. We remember Mother Teresa when she was saying that the reason why we don't have peace is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. My conclusion is that Rwandans are longing for genuine reconciliation, and the government's indication of commitment to it is, of course, commendable. However, the implementation of reconciliation is hampered by so many challenges. For example, the failure to address the ethnic issue, the problem with taking into consideration all conflict events, the failure to heal the wounds for everyone, victims, perpetrators, children born out of rape and women raped during the civil war and genocide, family members of perpetrators, family members of survivors. In few words, dehumanizing everyone. Reconciliation remains a long and a dynamic process which is paramount for peace to be promoted in Rwanda, but also in the region. Why in the region? Because Rwanda's conflict affected the entire region. Therefore, success or failure in reconciliation in Rwanda will impact either negatively or positively the Great Lakes region, but also the Eastern region as well. I was thinking perhaps that we also need an African Rising Peace Forum. But it takes honesty. For the case of Rwanda, it takes commitment, patience, and most importantly, courage and wisdom to promote genuine reconciliation. I will close my presentation with Albert Einstein's quote, because he wonders that we need an essential new way of thinking if mankind is to survive. Men, of course women, must radically change their attitudes toward each other and their views of the future. He was saying that today, perhaps today, we don't have much time left. And he argued that it's up to our generation to succeed, not to fail, to succeed in thinking differently. Because we should not fail. If we fail, he says that the days of a civilized humanity are numbered. In the same way, while concluding, I will adapt N.G. White writing about the greatest want of the world as far as peace, the culture of peace, reconciliation are concerned, and say that the greatest want of humanity, the greatest want of the world, the greatest want of Rwanda, the region, it is the want of men and women who can't be or who will not be bought or sold. Men and women who in the inmost souls are true and honest. Men and women who don't fear to call evil by its right name, and men who will stand for the right even though the heavens fall. I thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ezechiel. That's a really wonderful and inspiring talk, and thank you so much for taking us through the history and helping us to realize and remember that, of course, the fault lines for this for genocide and for the conflict were set decades before, and of course, due to various different legislations, due to colonialism, we know that it's not just something that suddenly happened, and so it's really important for us to remember that. And thank you again for taking us through all these systemic reconciliation systems that were put in place after the genocide. And I know we've got several questions in the Q&A, but I just wanted to raise just something about what we expect from people really in Rwanda, and maybe you can maybe talk just very briefly to this. I was going to say, when we talk about this desire for people to understand about reconciliation, and we talk about these training systems and programs that the Rwandan government has put in place, as well as what we're asking people, thinking as well about your quote there at the end about Albert Einstein, about asking people to think differently. All of this is quite an ask for an individual, isn't it? For an individual who is traumatized still, and who may be still living in poverty, in a situation where life is not easy, where they feel maybe that they have been discriminated against. And there seems to be a need for a high level of self-awareness and self-knowledge and willingness to engage on this sort of this improvement, this quest for reconciliation and forgiveness. So I just wondered if you could possibly just address that before we go into the question and answers. Sorry, everybody who's put questions there, we'll get there in a minute. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say that, yes, I totally agree with you, but that a high level willingness or self-knowledge is necessary at personal level, but also at institutional level. Mm. So there is a need for a political will and commitment, of course, which goes together with institutions, but also people should reach that level of understanding and the willingness also to engage, who, including survivors, including victims, right? Yeah. Sometimes the perpetrators, you find themselves confined in their guilt, sure? So, but survivors can do something. political leadership can do something. This is key. That's why I was saying that, yes, even though the grassroots may be willing to do something at a higher level, institutional support is very important.
Yeah.
The political leadership, willingness and commitment, these infrastructures which should be conducive, creating a political space for this to happen is very important. So this kind of integration and hybridity is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to go to the questions now. And first of all, I have a question from Hudri, who says, how do you perceive the reconciliation proposed by the military? What about the role of the military in Rwanda's political realm? That was from earlier on in your presentation.
Yeah. Reconciliation by the military. In Rwanda, everyone is involved. That's the policy of the government, including the military. And the approach by the military is through mainly the camps, the solidarity camps. People who returned, especially those who were the former combatants, are brought to the camps and are sort of re-educated, right?
Yeah.
So the military plays an important role when they re-educate the former combatants, and especially when they reintegrate them. And this reintegration took place, and it's really, for me, I believe this is one of the steps, one of the mechanisms which are successful. Yeah. The reconciliation by the military is very important, and they did so. Of course, it has to be improved through the re-education camps where former combatants were brought and re-educated and reintegrated, either in the society, but also in the army.
And the other part was about the role of the military in Rwanda's political realm, really.
I don't know any other role if it's not part of supporting the existing mechanisms, besides helping former combatants to reintegrate army and the communities. The other role, I don't see the other role here, apart from asking about the role they played during the conflict, but not reconciliation. But perhaps they don't get the question very well here.
Maybe the person is asking about how what the role of the military currently is, because I mean sometimes we do hear about the Rwandan military and security forces, for example, don't we?
Perhaps he's referring to peacekeeping missions, right?
No, I don't think so. I think that he's talking about maybe about Rwandan security forces, I think.
Yeah. So apart from the solidarity camps, which are helping former combatants to reintegrate the army and the community, perhaps he's referring to the police through, not maybe the military, maybe the police, through what is called community policing, yeah. Where they work together with the community in different community-based processes of reconciliation. Perhaps he's referring to the police.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay, another question. What do you see as being the future for the culture of peace in Rwanda?
I see it's challenging. The future of the culture of peace is challenging. First of all, it is possible if there's this kind of willingness, but it is challenging because it requires to rework on the whole context which drove the conflict throughout the history and the recent past. So the culture of peace in Rwanda requires that people sit together, engage in a public dialogue, discuss all competing narratives about the past, about the facts, about the crimes, about different events that took place and that constituted a context within which violence and genocide were committed.
Mm.
That's the direction of the culture of peace I see that we should take. Yeah.
And
that's why I was suggesting perhaps a forum like Rising Africa Peace Forum to drive these efforts, to take into consideration all violent events that took place, not focusing on a single event. Yeah.
How important do you think, just I'm adding on to this really, how important do you think socioeconomic development is in this culture of peace and equity?
Yeah, socioeconomic justice is one of the key aspects. Socioeconomic development is one of the key aspects worth taking into consideration for the concern to be successful in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. Not only the conflict throughout history of Rwanda, the past of Rwanda was politically power driven, but the socio-economic inequality.
Mm. Yes.
Social injustice, unfair distribution of resources. This was one of the factors actually, which contributed to success, unfortunately, of violence and genocide. So inequality has to be reduced, poverty has to be addressed, social justice has to be addressed if we think of successful reconciliation in Rwanda. That's why I was referring to the say in Rwanda, which I kind of quote, the stomach. When the stomach is empty, ears for reconciliation don't hear.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question. What do you think contributed the most to reconciliation in Rwanda? The local mechanisms you discussed or the international assistance mentioned?
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, I believe that even though there are so many challenges, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, yes.
But grassroots-driven mechanisms played a kind of much more successful role in reconciliation. Yes, top-down approaches played a role, even though I consider it to be one-sided, focusing on genocide only, but bottom-up driven. In a way, sometimes that was hidden. Not only referred to the genocide, but also referred to other events, including the Civil War, I use my concept, other untold or unspeakable events that happened. So people were able to sit down themselves and discuss all those events and facts that happened, which is not the case in the public arena of Gacaca or the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission or the International Tribunal for Rwanda. Yeah.
Yes, I mean the Gacaca system it has been, as you rightly said, has been critiqued quite a lot. You know,
yeah.
who judges,
yeah.
you know, and who is telling the truth. All of
yes.
those, you know, those things can come into play, bias, etc. So that can be very, very difficult.
That's right. But as far as I'm concerned, and in my experience, actually, Gacaca was or is one of the most successful, one of the mechanisms which, if used effectively, can be successful and even used in other contexts.
Yeah.
Since the conflict, or since genocide or the civil war or other violent events took place in Rwanda among people themselves. They know each other, they know what happened. So involving them in a process, in a legal process, in a justice or restorative justice-based mechanisms, this is one of the best mechanisms. The shortcoming was that it was focusing on one single event. Otherwise, involving people who know each other, who know what happened, is one of the best mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
It cannot be, maybe it can't be successful at 100%, can be at 70 or 80 or 60 or 65%, but this is one of the mechanisms, if it was used successfully, or if it was used, it was applied to all the events, including the Civil War, because people know what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question from Professor Gordon Crawford. To what extent has the promotion of Rwandan identity and the outlawing of ethnic identity been successful? Or has ethnic identity merely been suppressed and remains below the surface? And what are the implications for reconciliation?
Yes. That's a very good question, and it's key for reconciliation in Rwanda. So the ethnic identities have been eclipsed. It's actually prescribed to refer to ethnicity in Rwanda. As far as I'm concerned, I think the implications is not favorable for reconciliation. Yes, focusing on unity of Rwandans is important, but since violence was committed in the name or with the use of ethnic labels, since the history, throughout the history of Rwanda up to present, the genocide, the civil war, all violence that have been committed in Rwanda were referring to ethnicity. They were including or referring to ethnicity. So denying ethnicity, eclipsing ethnicity does not contribute to reconciliation as far as I'm concerned. And that's why it sounds a paradox. It's paradoxical because you can't eclipse ethnic labels, whether they are socially constructed or not, but since they have been used for during violence, they are the basis for genocide and the civil war. If you eclipse them, but on the other hand, you refer to the genocide perpetrated against Tutsi, you bring in now the ethnic label here, it sounds confusing and contradictory, right?
Yeah.
So it hampers reconciliation when those ethnic labels are eclipsed. Yeah.
And of course, if we feel that it's below the surface, as the questioner asked, you know, if it just remains suppressed and below the surface, the frustrations of not being able to identify with your identity or your identity that you believe you have, and all that can be very difficult.
Yeah, and by the way, in Rwanda, the main issue is not people don't necessarily want to identify along ethnic labels. That's not the issue. The issue is not talking about that as a part of conflict, as part of memory, as part of remembering, as in the discussion. That's the issue. But people are not really, they really don't want to keep focusing on the ethnic labels, but eclipsing that in the discussions, which is absurd. So that's what people don't understand. So if you say genocide perpetrated against Tutsi, that's correct. Yes, people who were targeted were Tutsi, even though other people were killed too. That's a fact. Then calling a genocide perpetrated against Tutsi, but on the other hand, punishing people who are using those labels, sounds paradoxical, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but in the lives of people, in the private homes, wherever they are referring to those. That's why it is below the surface. It is used in the everyday life. And people are comfortable with that. It's not a problem with that. No, there's no problem with that. But people wonder why it is not the government's policy is not using that.
No.
People are still wondering why.
Another question from Fred Mudai. In balancing freedom of expression with peace-building caution, how strong are news media, especially talk radio, and new technologies, especially social media, for governance and democracy in post-conflict Rwanda? I'll repeat that. In balancing freedom of expression with peace-building caution, how strong are news media, especially talk radio, and new technologies, especially social media, for governance and democracy in post-conflict Rwanda? Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, this is a very important question also. I would say that freedom of expression is a non-negotiable human right. For good governance, for effective democracy to be promoted, news media or new technology, social media, the freedom of expression is important. Whether you agree or you disagree with what is shared in the news or social media, but it is important to know that, right?
Yeah.
So I will say that in few words that if there is no freedom of expression, then talking about good governance and democracy is just an utopia. It's really not understandable. It's very important. People have the right to express their own feelings, to share their own stories on whatever mechanism, communication mechanism, be it news or social media, whether we agree. That's what we call accommodation of all narratives or all stories for us to move forward. If we don't do that, I won't say that's good governance or that's democracy. I'll be lying, yeah.
Great. Another point, John Whitcomb says, fascinating talk, thank you. Are you hopeful for the future of the country? Do you think the challenges can be addressed successfully? And do you think the high level of Western investment successfully courted by Paul Kagame has been helpful? So are you hopeful? Can the challenges be addressed? And the high level of Western investment?
At the outset, I would say that personally, I'm somebody who is always driven by hope. I always hope that something positive will happen in Rwanda. As far as the Western investment, I would say that yes, of course, it is important because the Western investment, be it in the form of investment as such or in the form of aid, right? It's commendable and it's important, but also the Western investment should take part in what is happening in the country.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will all lose. Investors will lose, and Rwanda will also lose, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So Western investors should invest, of course, but they should also have a say on know what is happening, taking part in what is happening in the country. Otherwise, I hope the future of Rwanda, I always have hope. Yes, I compare what is happening out there, including Rwanda, as when people look for gold, right? It's not easy. It's very difficult. Some people can lose their lives. People can die. People can suffer. It may take long, but in the end, I have hope that something will happen. And I believe that one day, a very small country, tiny Rwanda, will be a good small book that the entire world will read. But we have to be careful. The other way around can happen too. Yeah. But still, I have hope. I would say so.
Great, thank you. Another question from Jessica Northey. To what extent is there a sharing of information between African countries about reconciliation processes and justice?
Sharing information between African countries, I believe that between African countries, they learn from each other, right?
Yeah.
In my experience, many countries came to Rwanda, especially regarding Gacaca courts process, to learn what happened, how Rwanda recovered, if really Rwanda recovered. So African countries came to Rwanda, or they get informed about Rwanda, how Rwanda recovered. Because African, they are watching, they don't want what happened in Rwanda to happen in other countries. So the exact extent to which the information is shared, perhaps I'm not sure how I can indicate the extent, but I would say to some extent, we learn from each other, I believe. But still, we need to learn from each other. We still need to learn from each other. There are so many things to learn from Africa, from respective countries, because even though Africa is Africa as a continent, but different countries have different cultures and customs. Yeah. So I'm not sure whether we have reached that very good extent to which we learn from each other. How long did Rwanda learn from South Africa? I don't know the extent. For example, South Africa is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Rwanda is a National Unity and Reconciliation, not truth, right? Did we learn from South Africa? Perhaps, or perhaps not. So I don't know the extent. Other mechanisms, Ubuntu from South Africa, other mechanisms, Ho'oponopono from, I think it's other countries. So we keep learning from each other, but the extent, I'm not sure about that. And I believe that we need to engage in research projects to see how can Africans learn from each other. Yeah.
Great. I've got another question here, Ezechiel, which is, would you, from Rabi Al-Hafid, would you say the international role is crucial in order for the fighting factions to sit down and talk to restore the state? Was that crucial, the role of the international actors?
Exactly, it's very crucial, the role of the international community. It's very crucial because we witnessed the absence of the international community, an example of the UN and others, to stop the genocide or the civil war or anything that happened in Rwanda. And of course, they intervened through bilateral kind of interventions, donations, and the kind. But for Rwanda to move forward in any domain, be it justice, be it reconciliation, peace, and whatever, governance, we strongly need the international community. We can't do things by our own. We realize how much when we do things by our own, what happens, right?
Yeah.
So I believe that Rwanda is still fragile. And if the international community is willing, that's the issue here too. Is the international community willing to do that? If the international community is willing, do they know what is happening? Do they know where to start from or where to help, right? Are they really willing? But if the international community is willing, then I believe Rwanda will change from where it is to good.
I think it's about sharing, isn't it, rather than imposing. And I mean, obviously, it's with Paul Kagame's position and the authority that he has, and of course the power that he has, you know, within the region and in all of sub-Saharan Africa, really, and globally. So he's an important person to, you know, and to encourage us to and other countries to be involved, maybe in sitting down and solving issues, for example. I mean, I know
That's right.
You're very keen on not being dependent upon aid, for example.
That's right, exactly. Not imposing, of course. Imposing has never been a good solution as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But in the form of partnership, working together. Yeah, not imposing, but intervening to support where it is necessary. Supporting, but also intervening when it is necessary. There's support when it is requested, but also intervening when it is necessary. Yeah. Well, the president is responsible for the country. So if he is responsible, I believe he needs support. I believe he needs advice. Yes. Yeah. Very important advice. Exactly. The necessary advice. From the international community.
Well, we've answered all the questions that we've been given here, and thank you so much, Ezechiel, for a fascinating session that we've had. I just want to, I don't know if Richard wants to say anything. I wanted to give our thanks for your answering those questions as well. We could carry on for a long, long time.
That's right.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to hear from you again at some point.